So I want in this video to give a bit of an overview to Ralph Ellison's second and unfinished novel. This is a text, a manuscript, whatever you want to say, that I've been working on for a while. I should have some articles on it coming out, but these things take a lot of time often. But anyway, I think it's a really interesting book that a lot of people don't know about, even people who are really into literature and follow literature. I think many people don't really know that Ralph Ellison wrote a second novel. Didn't exactly finish it. I'll talk about that a little bit. Of course, Ralph Ellison is most famous for the book Invisible Man, which many people will have had to read at some point during their educational career. Not everyone. I don't think it was ever a requirement in my high school or college or anything like that, but of course I had heard of it. Of course, I'm kind of a book lover, so I'd seen it in bookstores, and I knew something about it before I even actually ever read it. And of course, it's considered one of the great American novels, one of the top novels of the 20th century. Won awards. I think was it the National Book Award or something. In the 50s, it came out in 1952. What's not as well known, unless you're really into Ralph Ellison, is that he worked for like 40 years after Invisible Man was published on a second novel and produced quite a lot of materials for that novel. And it's actually, I think, a really important work and not very well known. So I'm going to try to give what I'm calling a quick guide to Ralph Ellison's unfinished novel, also called, as you can maybe see at the top there, also called the Hickman novel. The material here is a little bit different organization than I usually use, so hopefully it will make sense and is visible in all of that. But I basically have a table that I want to get to, but I also want to give some main points first. So I think I would consider his second novel a major work of American fiction. It's in some ways a fictionalization of America. It's an exploration of the meaning of America, of course talking about the United States here, of the United States of America, and its what it is, what its constitution is through history as something in process, in progress. So I think it is a major work. It's different than, you have to treat it in a way that's different than a formally published novel. I'll talk about some of those issues. So just a little bit of background. It was written between around 1955. He had been thinking about it, I think, even while finishing up Invisible Man, or shortly after that. And then I think really started to put ideas onto paper around 1955. And was writing it up to the time of his death. I think he died in 1994, if I'm getting the year correctly, and just a few months before that. We have some of the last recorded work that he did, where we can actually trace the date. Some of the last kind of revisions on that second novel, on materials for that second novel. It's a little hard to say what exactly the themes are of the unfinished novel. It covers a lot of stuff. I think there's a lot of themes. I don't know if you can point to one thing tying it all together. If I had to point to one thing, I might say something like the possibilities and the failures of democracy, of American democracy. There's also quite a lot about generational and ethnic interdependence and difference, and related to that, multiculturalism and hybridity. So it's about, partly about what it means to form a country in which all these different groups are in some sense equal, or should be in some sense equal, or should be in many senses equal, but in which there are also differences. Differences remain And also the groups are not totally distinct. They're overlapping, they're mixed. Everyone has many things going on in them. I think at the early stage, Ralph Ellison saw this book as about the evasion of identity. And that is a big theme of it. And in a way about the difficulty of American identity. Ellison always saw Americans as having the problem of identity, as being the kind of major American problem. The problem of our identity being that we're so diverse and mixed and different, but also part of the same group, the same ideal in another broader sense. A lot of influences on this book, which I think you can detect if you become aware of them. And it's an interesting thing about the book. I think you can detect different influences in different materials that he composed for the book or set of books. We'll talk about, I won't talk about too much, but it is worth mentioning that it's not exactly one book. It could be considered 2 or 3 or more books, depending on how you look at it. And I think Ellison himself had different ways of looking at it. But major influences, Melville was a big influence, especially The Confidence Man, the book, Melville's novel, if that even is a novel. I mean, it's hard to say exactly if this unfinished novel is really a novel, and The Confidence Man is certainly an unusual novel if it's a novel at all. So Melville's The Confidence Man is a big influence, especially on one of the central characters and the construction of the central character of Bliss/Sunraider, who I'll also briefly introduce. Joyce is a big influence. Again, Joyce, another person who really expanded what the novel is, kind of gave a new meaning to the novel, showed new possibilities for the novel. Joyce famously used myth. I think especially we're talking about Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, when we're looking at the influences Ellison took from Joyce. He's really a kind of a Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake type of guy. And those experimental aspects, I think, influenced how he thought about his later work. How Ellison thought about his later work. Faulkner, again, kind of an experimental novelist in a lot of ways. And maybe also André Malraux, French novelist, among other things. Malraux was a complicated guy. Ellison knew his work well. I think Malraux influences especially the first book, so-called book of the novel. I should also probably add Dostoevsky. It's a little bit hard to say. With some of these, I think Melville, Joyce, Faulkner, Malraux, you can point to specific sections of the novel that were kind of have that heavy influence. Dostoevsky, it's a little harder for me to say, but dreams, there's a lot of dreams in the book, and Ellison has claimed to derive the use of dreams in fiction from especially Dostoevsky. So I should maybe add Dostoevsky on there, but I won't do it right now. So parts of the book have been published, are available to the public. The second book and some other materials were published as Juneteenth. This is a really important part of, well, all the parts are important, but this was a part that was more polished. I don't know, the editors have said, if I remember correctly, that the second book was more polished, feels more polished than the first, and there's a way in which maybe that's true. I don't know if it's I don't see as big a difference there as maybe they did, but nevertheless. More materials, including book 2, including much of the materials that were published in Juneteenth, were published in 3 days before the shooting. I have the cover for that over here. 3 days before the shooting. And that covers the pretty late draft, or relatively late drafts of book 1 and book 2 of the novel, as well as materials that we might call book 3 for lack of a better word, or just to kind of tie it all together. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the whole history of composition, but there's definitely some broad sections that we could call book 1 and book 2, and that Ellison himself called book 1 and book 2. And then there's some kind of additional materials that we could maybe, it's not exactly quite right to call it book 3 altogether, but I'm going to call it book 3 just for convenience. But maybe parts of them should fit into books 1 and book 2, and then maybe you also have some stuff left over that would be a book 3. The organization here is complicated. Just to tell you a little bit about what it actually is about, what actually is happening in this novel, it centers around the character Bliss Sunraider, who seems to be white, but he's also culturally black. He's raised by African Americans, so he looks white. And he becomes capable of acting white, but he also is culturally black. And that's kind of through all of the characters, pretty much, Ellison is showing our American mixed-upness, our hybridity. And so Bliss / Sunraider, he starts out, he's named Bliss. Later he changes his name to Adam Sunraider and becomes a senator, a United States Senator. The other character is Bliss's foster father, Alonzo Hickman, who is an African-American Southern preacher, so a religious gentleman from the South, but he starts out his life as a jazz musician, or as a young man. He's a jazz musician, later changes his ways after the baby Bliss falls into his protection. And then two other major characters. There is Bliss's or Sunraider's son, named Severin, who also becomes Sunraider's assassin, tries to shoot his father. And Severin also is a mixed character, the result of Bliss's affair with or dalliance or whatever. Neither of them are married at the time, but youthful kind of dalliance with a mixed black Indian, if I remember, girl. That's a whole long story in itself. So Severin is mixed also, although he can pass for white. And then the other major character is, a reporter named Wellborn McIntyre, who witnesses some important events of the novel and tries to investigate some of the events that happen in the novel and figure out what do they mean. And he runs into some of the characters, depending on which materials you're looking at. But anyway, McIntyre is more a run-of-the-mill northern liberal white guy. He's the main character in book 1, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And he's sort of a character, I think, that Ellison felt maybe his white readers would identify with and help them kind of get into the world of the novel than if it was just about these more mixed characters of Bliss, Severin, and Hickman. Hickman himself is African American, but he's also supposedly mixed with other things, probably white slave owners at some point in his family's history, Native Americans at some point in his family's history. So yeah, all the main characters are mixed. McIntyre is a little different because he's more kind of pure European white guy character. So the book is the novel is organized roughly according to the main character. So, as I said, you can think of the book as the novel as divided into different books, and Ellison at least had formal drafts of book 1 and book 2. And McIntyre dominates book 1. Book 1 is McIntyre's story of witnessing the assassination and of him trying to figure out what's going on and going through this kind of dark night of the soul as he interacts with all these black characters and has his view of reality kind of disoriented, shattered, maybe even. So McIntyre is a really interesting character just because Ellison puts him through this dark night where he has his beliefs, his assumptions challenged. Bliss / Sunraider and Alonzo Hickman, his father, dominate Book 2. Book 2 is basically set in the hospital where Bliss, or I should say Sunraider, is recovering after, possibly recovering after being shot by his son Severin. And so Book 2 is largely a kind of dialogue between Sunraider and Hickman, not always an explicit actual dialogue. They do seem to converse face to face, but Hickman is there in the room, but they're also imagining what they would say to each other, and they're imagining their history together and things like that. And then much of the other material that can't be kind of directly placed in Book 1 or Book 2, and a lot of that material, Hickman is the dominant character. So you have Hickman figuring out that there's going to be this attempt on his adopted son's life, and then he's figuring out what to do about that and what actually are the details of this. And yeah, Hickman dominates all that material. Some of this is taken over from McIntyre. So at some stages, McIntyre was supposed to do more investigating in other parts of the country, talking to figures from Sunraider's past. But in later material, Hickman takes over this function more and more. And so where exactly that would fit, would it be its own separate book? Would it be part of Book 1 or Book 2? I think Ellison did not exactly decide. I think he was working toward a synthesis, but it did not really happen, of course, before he died. So the novel has an interesting status. Is it finished? Well, it's certainly not finished, but in what sense is it unfinished? So is it unfinished? Is it unfinishable? Is it something else? In other words, was it just unfinished, but given enough time? Could it have been finished? Or was there just no way that it could ever be finished as a kind of traditional novel, even a kind of extended novel like Joyce gave us, or other people, Melville even? Was it a failure or was it a success? I think there's many different ways to look at this. I think one early view was that it was a failure, that Ellison just worked on this and ultimately just failed. I've read through quite a lot of the materials at this point that he wrote for this book, and I would not be willing to call it a failure. I think there is a lot of great stuff in there. I think you have to abandon, in a way, your preconceptions about what a novel is. That's why I've pointed to people like Melville and Joyce and Faulkner, who expanded what we can take the novel to be. It's almost something that would be more appropriate for the internet age, for the hypertext age, for the digital age. And maybe one day, I'm hopeful. I don't know that anyone's doing any work on this. I would like to see it happen, but hopefully one day they'll have digitized all this material and you can kind of put together your own novel. They've done this with other things, with other unfinished novels, made kind of digital versions where you can compare stuff and put stuff together in different ways that might be interesting to you. So I would call it a success, but it's not a success as a traditional novel, certainly. But it's a success as something different, maybe something new. So yeah, it has an uncertain structure. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the novel still. Ellison was changing, because he was trying to reflect what America was becoming as he was writing it. And also I think he was changing his understanding of what literature was. And there's a tension there between narrative And especially, I think book one is really narratively driven. It might be an easy way to introduce yourself into the world of the novel because there is a pretty clear narrative. There's not exactly a resolution, right? It doesn't have like a clear the end. It leads into more stuff. It leads into book two. But it is fairly narrative, and putting the character of McIntyre through these obstacles and stuff to kind of get something out of him, change him in some way, which is a very narrative kind of thing. There's a narrative drive, a kind of building towards catharsis, which maybe never quite comes, but you can see that build up there. So that's one thing that is going on in these materials, the materials of the second novel. There's also more of a dialogical exploration among different voices, among ideas, among episodes, where it's not so much building towards a climax or catharsis or resolution, but just exploring the ins and outs, the details of personality, of culture, and things like that. So in a way, you can think of it as maybe a puzzle with no right solution. You have all these pieces, and your job as a reader is to put something together, make something out of it, right? They're not just, pieces is not quite the appropriate word. They're very compelling, exciting, interesting, sometimes tedious pieces that I think you can make some broader meaning out of if you put them together. So it does build to something, some picture of America, some mosaic or something like that. So that you can think of, if you try to read this book, which I do recommend if you're really interested in literature, I think it is a really major work of literature, and the most easily accessible way to get at it is in 3 days before the shooting. But yeah, if you approach it, you have a kind of curatorial job to do, a kind of arrangement job to do. But that's not unprecedented. You find that to some extent in Joyce's later novels. You're not exactly an arranger there, but you find this kind of dialogical exploration in Joyce's later novels, where it's not really narratively driven. There's kind of a loose narrative there, but the point is not to achieve this kind of climax catharsis moment. In a way, it could just go on and on and on. And you have other novels where you basically have a lot of pieces and you can put them together in different ways and maybe are encouraged to put them together how you want. So things like Hopscotch, Invisible Cities, Dictionary of the Khazars, some of these are, I think these are all during Ellison's lifetime. I don't know that he was aware of any of these later novels. But definitely those kinds of developments were happening where it was seeing novels more as a way to explore ideas, put things into relations with each other that are not necessarily narrative relations. And you can maybe debate about whether those are still count as novels, but in any case, it's some kind of literature, and you might want to see Ralph Ellison's unfinished novel in that way, in this context. It might make more sense in that way. Just to give a brief overview of the materials that you would encounter, and again, a lot of this has been published in, or not a lot, but a fairly big section of materials have been published in 3 days before the shooting, including what I'm calling Book 1, Book 2, and Book 3. The Library of Congress has pretty much all the materials, many more materials than have actually been published. So there's a lot to explore if you have the means. So book 1, I would say the major influence is probably something like Malraux, kind of existentialism. There's some European scenes. one of the main characters, not really a main character, but one of the important characters, kind of important secondary characters, is named after one of Malraux's characters in one of his novels. So I think Faulkner kind of runs throughout. Dostoevsky kind of runs throughout, maybe as major influences. But I would maybe say book one is more of a Malraux influence, whereas book two, where you have this dialogue between Bliss/Sunraider and Hickman, is more of a Faulkner-Melville influence. I think especially, well, I don't know. All of the books are really dialogue heavy. There's not a lot of narrative exposition. I think there's probably more kind of traditional narrative exposition in book one, which is told through the first person. And then really the book two and book three materials are really like soliloquies and dialogues and stuff. And I think a lot of that was maybe comes out of Ellison's reading of Faulkner, which is also very telling a story through stories and through stories told by characters and through dialogues and things like that, at least in certain Faulkner novels. And Richard Wright was influenced a lot by that too, telling a story through people talking to each other. Major themes in book one. Book one's a little different in that it centers around a white character. So there's this white liberalism versus white conservatism thing that goes on between McIntyre, who's a kind of northern liberal, and one of his colleagues called McGowan, who's a southern conservative. And Ellison has a really interesting take on that, kind of subversive take on that. Race relations are also big. McIntyre spends a lot of the time interacting with black characters and kind of struggling with his experiences that he has with these black characters. Whereas book two is probably less about whiteness, I would say. That's is difficult to say for sure, because of course that is a theme there, definitely, maybe a secondary theme. The character of Bliss or Sunraider is, as I said, probably genetically white but culturally black. So that is a theme, but it's much more, I think, about love, kind of the love between Hickman and Sunraider, hope, Hickman's hope for the country and for Bliss Sunraider. It's also about generational conflict, I think, with the conflicts between Bliss and Hickman and between Bliss and his estranged son Severin. And of course, race relations, hybridity, big themes in book two. I'll maybe discuss book three separately because it's somewhat different. The main secondary characters in book one, you've got Sunraider. A bunch of other, different secondary characters in book one and book two. They're fairly different in terms of the cast of characters. But Hickman is kind of ties things together. Sunraider to some extent, Hickman to a greater extent. One of the major characters that McIntyre is grappling with in book one is the black preacher Hickman, the father to Sunraider, and both McIntyre and Hickman witness the shooting of Sunraider at the beginning, and they get into confrontation with each other later on at the hospital where Sunraider is being treated. And let's see, any other I think I'll kind of skip the other secondary characters. So I want to keep trying to keep this high level, although I've been already talking for longer than I expected. And many major episodes in each book one and book two. I'm not going to try to go through all of these, but you can see McIntyre dominates, of course, book one. It's a lot about what he sees, what he witnesses, what he experiences, his memories of the war, of serving in World War II, going to Europe, his experiences in Europe, his memories of his affair with a young black woman when he was a youth. And, it's another kind of this interracial relationship thing. And he has to deal with the girl's mother at some point and kind of confront these cultural differences, racial differences. There's this very crazy scene. I think it's one of the most interesting episodes probably in the book. There's a lot of quite interesting episodes, but this scene in Jesse Rockmore's townhouse, which is visited both by McIntyre and by Hickman in the different books, is pretty wild and incredible, and I'm not going to try to get into the details, but it's pretty, it's something. So I recommend the book just for reading that scene. Kind of wild stuff, getting into different racial things, and anyway. Book 2, anything I especially want to point out? So book 2, we hear a lot about the history of Bliss, his childhood. And there's some really intense stuff there too. This Juneteenth scene where it's kind of this big religious celebration, and then this woman shows up who claims to be Bliss's mother. Is she really his mother? That's really intense, and it leads into this scene between Bliss and this young lady, Sister Georgia, which is almost like a sexual awakening on Bliss's part. But it's also a pretty intense and strong scene. Dreams go throughout. So book 1, you have this really long dream of McIntyre, and Ellison wrote many versions of this dream. I think it was a really important scene for him, and he developed it in many different ways. You get one version of that in the published book. Sunraider has his own dream, very lengthy dream in book 2, and you get this scene at Rockmore's townhouse from Hickman's perspective and from his assistant, or I don't know if assistant is the right religious term here, but his Deacon Willite. Then you've got this book 3, which is it's not exactly a book, but I'm just calling it for convenience, book 3, of these other materials, which are more Faulknerian and Joycean, kind of exploratory. Again, it's much less narrative. A lot of these were developed later. So book 1 and book 2, the kind of finished drafts for those, or relatively finished drafts, late drafts for those, were written on typewriter in the 1970s. And some parts of those he continued to develop those in the 80s and 90s. But he also developed a much more broader kind of material in the 80s and 90s, writing on a computer, early personal computers, focused really around Hickman and from Hickman's perspective. And in a way, it's much more Joycean, I would say, where you get a lot of these soliloquies by Hickman, Hickman's dialogues with other characters, his memories, just kind of these riffs that he goes on, internal monologues. It's really different in a way, and you have to take a different approach to it, I think. Book 1 and book 2, they're fairly narrative. Book 2 maybe less narrative than book 1, and these other materials that I'm categorizing as book 3 are kind of less narrative still. So it becomes less intense in a way. It becomes less narrative, so you're less like on the edge of your seat wondering what's going to happen. But it becomes compelling in a different kind of way, which is hard to explain. I'm not quite sure how to explain it. I've been calling it exploratory or dialectical or something as opposed to narrative. I don't know if that is helpful. But yeah, some of these same themes continuing. Yeah, so there's a lot of cultural stuff. You get a lot of hybridity. You get a lot of mixed up kinds of things. People who are mixed, activities that are mixed, cultural mixture. You get a lot of generational stuff going on. You get that in book 2 and book 1 as well to some extent, but it's very strong in book 3. There's a lot of fathers and sons and grandfathers, especially mothers. To some extent, I think females play a lesser role in Ellison's fiction. They play a very important role, even in his short stories. There's a lot of mothers. And in Invisible Man, there's kind of this mother-like character. So the motherhood is definitely there, but of course the major characters are men. So the kind of idea of fatherhood is a little more heavily represented. Fatherhood, grandfatherhood, generation to generation. Yeah, and some different characters come in. Many of these are hinted at in book 2. You can look at the book 3 materials, kind of not really book 3, book 3 but not book 3 materials, can be divided by where they happen into 3 sections. You've got this Hickman in Washington, D.C., Alonzo Hickman kind of wandering around Washington, D.C., and then you have him earlier in Georgia and Oklahoma, where you have him trying to figure out what is going to happen. He gets this hint that something is going to happen to Sunraider, who he suspects is in fact Bliss. But Bliss has run away. Bliss at some point runs away when he's like a adolescent or something. And I forget the exact age when he is supposed to have run away, but in any case, he runs away. And they try to follow him, but they lose track of him. But they kind of can figure out what he's up to once in a while. But they don't know for sure if he has become this senator, but they suspect that he has. And anyway, it's a whole complicated backstory there. But you have these scenes in Georgia and in Oklahoma where Hickman is trying to figure out what is going on, and he interacts with all these kind of interesting personalities that Ellison has developed, these interesting characters. Yeah, they're all powerful. Oh, yeah, the scenes with Janie are really powerful. The stuff with Love New, this character Love New, who's this Native American, kind of culturally Native American, but seems to have been mixed with probably with slave peoples. So he's very dark, looks kind of African American, but culturally he's more Native American. And those scenes are pretty intense as well. There's this section of the book called The Cave, which is basically this long story. These scenes with Love New, basically Love New goes on these long stories, historical kind of history, but told in kind of a mythic register, or even kind of like a folk tale register, kind of converting his version of events into folk tales, into myths. And these are, some crazy stuff in a way. There's a section called The Cave, which goes on for a long time. It deals with fathers and sons again, with generational differences, with breaks kind of in generations, and what the sacrifices maybe that you need to make for your children. And it's quite a section. I mean, it's kind of like Ellison develops these books within books. So you've got these stories within stories within stories, and it develops something really, really rich, I think. And Cleophas is another major storyteller in these materials. Cleophas is a kid that Severin grew up with. Trying to keep things straight here. So he's a young man when Hickman meets him, as is Severin. And he's kind of developed as a storyteller, a nightclub storyteller, and there's some wild stuff there too. Yeah, so the Georgia stuff is more brief, as I recall. There's other important stories within stories. So it's Hickman kind of reading these long, long letters. So he's reading this letter from Janie, who's his old flame, this woman he was in love with, who raised Severin after Severin's mother kills herself. And I'm giving spoilers here, but it's not anything that would, you really have to read how things are done in order to get the impact. Knowing that this or that happens is not so important. It's understanding kind of all the context that Ellison gives and how it's portrayed that gives it the impact. So anyway, Janie is the person who raises Severin and then has Severin taken away from her by one of Sunrider's intermediaries. It's complicated, but she's an interesting character, and she sends this long letter to Hickman. Also, this Millsap report is another really interesting thing, and it's written in more of an academic register. So here again, you get this kind of Dostoevskian heteroglossia, where you get these different registers put together, kind of folk registers, vernacular, and then you've got some things that are religious speeches, and even with Millsap, you get this kind of academic report on what has happened to Bliss and kind of this academic or sociological analysis. So yeah, all these different registers come together. I think that's kind of this, Dostoevskian, but also Joycean influence. Of course, Joyce's Ulysses is told through many different registers as well, many different dialects. And Ellison does something different. So I should probably conclude here, because I talked far longer than I was expecting to. I thought this would be more of a quick introduction. But given that the materials are many, many, many thousands of pages, I guess this maybe does count, after all, as a quick introduction or a quick guide, considering, again, thousands of pages. But hopefully that helps a little bit in maybe understanding, appreciating Ellison's second novel. Maybe it will make you want to read some of the one of the published versions of that. Again, there's two, Juneteenth and 3 Days Before the Shooting, which I've pictured here. Again, take it as something that is not your ordinary novel, something maybe more like these kind of experimental novels that were published in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. Something maybe more Joycean, extending even what Joyce did, although it's not so obscure maybe as something like Finnegan's Wake. I mean, Ellison was very, he was very trying very much to keep to the vernacular, trying to write in understandable idioms, the idioms that people used. But the structure of the book you take it as experimental, right? He's trying to capture something about the essence of the experiment that is the United States of America, as it changed over the course of his life, as his ideas about what literature is and should do changed. But it is a very compelling, individual sections of it are very compelling, exciting, beautiful. They'll make you feel, they'll make you laugh, they'll make you cry. But just don't expect going in that it's going to be a novel in a traditional sense with a kind of beginning, middle, and end. It's something bigger and perhaps something more meaningful as a representation of the U.S. All right. Well, I will stop here. There's a lot more to say, but that hopefully gives a little bit of a decent overview and guide to the book. All right. Thank you for listening. That's all for now.